Hey, welcome back, Warrior Next Door listeners. Welcome to the second installment of the John Little series. In this episode, he's going to talk about combat. He's going to talk about what it was like to enter the theater and fight his way up the boot of Italy. So strap in.
You never didn't know where you was going, Dave. We didn't know we was going to North Africa, but we got there. And all at once we woke up and as we pulled in close to the harbor, they was bombing the harbor in Casablanca, North Africa. Germans were.
What thoughts were going through your mind when you realized that you were actually being deployed in a war zone?
Well, just like everybody else, they couldn't wait till they got there. But we had to wait.
Yeah.
Not like it was then. Now.
What was it like when you guys got off the ship and on to Casablanca? What was there? Was the war with the Germans wrapping up? Were you guys in a camp? What did you see when you got on land?
They broke you down in sizes. Some went to Algiers, Tunisia, and they sprinkled you all over the North Africa. And then they started sending them into Italy. And I was just lucky enough. I went to Naples, Italy. And that's
When you say lucky enough, what do you mean by that?
well, because some places are worse than other places.
Mm.
But Algiers and Tunisia, they had the same equipment, had the same everything as 34th Division had.
Mm.
And then when you were sent to an outfit, they called you a replacement. That's what they called it.
How did you feel about that? How well did you fit in with these guys? How did that work?
They're glad to see you. You're glad to see anybody. That just made them stronger, made the division more strong.
So real quick before we jump in, I just want to talk about he's on a troop ship with thousands of men, and they're pulling into Casablanca, and the Germans are bombing the harbor they're pulling into.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, hold on a second.
Welcome to North Africa.
Yes, what a welcome, Matt, you see there. But also, wouldn't you be like, get me the heck off this damn boat? I want to get ashore. And second, this just speaks maybe to the order of operations for the Germans. We all hear about how rigid they were in their command structure, where they would be paralyzed and they had to wait till they got approval from their superiors to do things. Why wouldn't they look at that troop ship as a target of opportunity and go after it? Maybe they did. I don't know, but it seems like, man, they literally dodged something there that could have been very bad.
Well, let me take you through a quick timeline so that I think that'll answer your question about why they were being bombed, but maybe not as effectively as it could have been. So we just learned that he is going to be a replacement for the 35th Infantry Division. Now, the 35th Infantry Division was already constituted through the peacetime draft and whatnot prior to World War II, December 7th, 1941. In January 26th, 1942, right, just a little over a month after the war had started, this unit landed in Dufferin Quay, Belfast, Ireland. It was the first infantry unit from the United States to make it to Europe, was the 35th Infantry Division. They would train there. They would actually have some of their men siphoned off to be trained in commando units. So they got a lot of training and updated from what the British had learned fighting the Germans the past 2 years before that. And then on November 8th of 1942, so that same year that they landed, they would go and participate in Operation Torch. And there they would fight across North Africa. And that would go on until May 13th of 1943. So May 1943, we had pushed the Germans out of North Africa. We were getting ready to invade Sicily. That wouldn't happen until July. And it was, so this is when he was, going through training camp. So he arrived in Morocco on November 27th, 1943, according to his bio. So what had transpired is we had not only secured North Africa, but the 34th Infantry Division was not part of the invasion of Sicily, which took place in July of that year and would last, about 2 or 3 weeks. But in September 9th of 1943, they would participate in the invasion of mainland Europe, of Italy, and they would attack Salerno. And that's where Mark Clark's Fifth Army, which the 34th Infantry was part of, would go to Salerno. And the Salerno landings were described as a debacle. The Salerno landings were across 35 miles. The troops were spread out. They had this big river between them, the Sele River. Mark Clark was warned about some of these things. He went on the beach. He got really aggressive. And when Kesselring came and attacked, they almost pushed them off the beach. The attack at Salerno is almost described as terrible as what happened in Tarawa with the Marines in the Pacific in terms of the casualties that were incurred per unit area. But we would hold on, largely in part thanks to naval gunfire of all things. So the naval guns came in there, pushed the German armored units back. They would stay, but the division got severely bloodied. And so as the division worked their way off the beachhead, they worked their way north, they took Naples. They were in Naples being repaired, being reconstituted. He was a replacement for those troops in the 34th who not only got bloodied in North Africa last year, but just got bloodied landed in Salerno on basically the shin of the boot of Europe. And so he's getting ready to transfer over there. So what that means is this: the Germans and their airfields and Italians were all pushed back up into northern Italy. Their ability to attack those troop transports were compromised. So if that troop transport went into Casablanca in 1942, mid 1942, the Germans and the Italian Air Force would have probably sunk it. But by this point in the war, yeah, the Germans and the Italians could still attack, or the Germans could, but they couldn't do it as effectively. That's the only thing that saved his butt, in my view.
So, and I touched on this at the beginning of the podcast, but what's fascinating to me is the timing of Italy's surrender.
Yes,
because it's right at the beginning of September of 43. And so we come across from North Africa to Sicily, and that was in July. You said July of 43. We're in Sicily.
Yep.
And then we land early September on mainland Italy. And it's funny, interesting to me how Italy is kind of like, the closer we got to them, the more they're like, I don't know about this. And then they signed the armistice, early September of 43. Then it's just the Germans on their own after that.
Yeah.
So that plays into the whole timeline too. And in fact, is what's all changing. That's why I meant when I said there's a lot of things, that very dynamic things happening on this front here.
Totally. And you that's a great point. So before we even land on Salerno, which is September 9th, on September 3rd, a week before that, Italy abdicates. They take Mussolini and they imprison him. And the King Victor Emmanuel basically appointed a new marshal who was the conqueror of Ethiopia to head a new government. They signed an armistice with the Allies. Before we even land on Salerno, there are literally men on ships ready to invade Salerno when they hear that that Italy's out of the war. And a lot of men falsely think, well, maybe this won't be a big deal. Maybe the Germans will leave Italy and we can just work on, the larger operations that we're doing in Normandy or southern France. That didn't happen. This is from Donald Miller's The Story of World War II. When word reached Hitler that Italy had defected, he disarmed the Italian army, shipped off 600,000 Italian troops to slave labor camps in Germany, and rescued Mussolini from his Italian captors in a daring raid on a mountain top hotel by parachutes and SS troops in gliders.
Yep. I've watched there's a really interesting top secret battles or secret missions of World War II series that I watched. There was an episode on that specific rescue of Mussolini. The other thing I wanted to mention, and this is something that confused me, like, oh, wait a second, if the Italians basically surrendered, early 19 September 43, well, what about Anzio? What's that all about?
Yeah.
That's been told. That's another landing that we were told, that we've learned is a very hard fought landing. Well, that was actually in January of 44.
Yes. And it's
And
really, and Ryan, you're right. This is really confusing because,
it is.
first we have the invasion in Salerno, which is called Operation Avalanche. That's on basically the shin of the boot, just south of Naples.
Okay.
Going up the toe in the heel is the British 8th Army. They're supposed to meet with the 5th Army and then work their way up. They get up to Naples. Everything seems okay. They go north of Naples, halfway between where they are in Naples and Rome, and they hit the Gustav Line.
Mm-hmm.
While that's being assaulted, almost at the same time, we do this invasion in Anzio. And
so we're actually coming up the peninsula.
Yep.
And that's where John is.
Yep.
He's coming up and he's getting ready to hit Monte Cassino.
In the first battle of Monte Cassino, there's 4 battles.
Yes, but we're also going to do another, like almost like a pincer movement, and come around and land at Anzio.
Yep.
And we're trying to put pressure and get them to squeeze out, and we can go up.
That's what they're hoping to do. It was Churchill's idea to invade Anzio. And
I didn't know any of this. I didn't really understand the full order of how this whole thing transpired and everything. So go ahead.
I didn't either. I initially thought that Anzio, which was another horrible battle along with Monte Cassino, I thought it happened much later, after the assault on the Gustav Line, which Monte Cassino and the Abbey was part of. We're going to talk more about that in a minute as John speaks to it. But the bottom line is in the sequence of events, when John joins the 34th, they've already invaded Italy. They're in Naples. They're being reconstituted. They're about to attack what is called the Gustav Line, which runs kind of across the boot of Italy, just north of Naples. There'd be 4 battles there. And the first battle in January of that year, just a month or 2 after he got into Casablanca, we did an amphibious landing that was it was suggested by Winston Churchill. And it was seen as really controversial because, Churchill made some bad decisions with things like this in the past, like the invasion of Gallipoli, in World War I. So a lot of the generals didn't really want him meddling in this. But Winston Churchill's idea was, let's go behind the Gustav Line with an amphibious attack them from the rear, and roll the whole thing up and be done with it. And it almost worked. And when we get to some of the clips where he talks about being at Anzio, I'm gonna unpack that a bit more.
Okay.
But what we'll do next is we'll play the clip where, he's going to leave Casablanca, join the 34th, and do the first assault on the Gustav Line. Monte Cassino. So take us through your journey from Naples up into combat in Italy.
Well, in Monte Cassino was a town down here, but Monte Cassino was way up here on top where the monastery was. And it really wasn't supposed to be any fire shooting going on there because it was a religious place. Mm-hmm. The Catholics had they just call it the monastery. Mm-hmm. But there was a lot of close combat there. But after the war, they blamed the Italian blamed the Americans for bombing it. They finally had to bomb it to ever take it down, the monastery.
Were you there before they bombed it?
Oh yeah.
So you saw the monastery before it was bombed?
Yes. 200 bombers came over at the same time. they'd pulled us off the line where they could drop the bomb because they knew some of them will roll down the hill before they went off. They had a delayed bomb, you know. You probably never heard that word before, but they would burst in the air, or they could make them hit the ground and go off. So we called them delayed action bombs. But they bombed it at they sent 200 bombers over at the same time.
Wow.
What do you remember about the bombing? Could you feel the concussions? Were you guys happy they bombed it? What were you thinking when it happened?
Well, like you said, that the British is the one that bombed it, but the Americans got blamed for it, for bombing Abbey. But there was American plane bombers, all right, because you could see the sign on them. Of course, they didn't dive down. They had those flying fortresses, you know, and they just dropped them all at the same level. And they were 200 bombers.
Were the troops, were you guys happy that it was being bombed? Did you feel like it would be helpful?
Well, yeah, we thought it would be. But the Polish cemetery is exactly where the bombing took place. Yeah.
Oh.
The Poles, you know, Poland, they got soldiers killed at Monastery Hill, the casino. Their cemetery, they chose that spot. Roosevelt let them choose any place they wanted to be put at their cemetery, and the Polish cemeteries there, and not too far from there, the German cemeteries there. They chose a spot. They let them choose where they wanted to bury their dead, and that's where they're buried. Not so far from the Monte Cassino.
So we're going to unpack the controversy of Monte Cassino in the next clip. What I'd like to cover now, because he doesn't speak much to it, is what he experienced when he joined the 31st or 34th Infantry Division and it was assaulting the Abbey and Casino. So the assault, there were 4 battles for Monte Cassino, and Monte Cassino was a strong point along the Gustav line that went across the shin or the calf of Italy, if you want to call it that, south of Rome. The objective was to break this line, roll up the German army, go into Rome, and be able to occupy the first of an Axis capital city ever in World War II. You got to remember, this is still very early 1944, January 1944. 1942 and 1943 were not very good years to the Allies. We did not have a lot of victories. So we needed something. So this battle took place in this very mountainous area. Cassino was a town by the Rapido River that they had to cross to get to the town. And then beyond the town in the hills, there were several of them. That's where the Germans were. That's where the Abbey was. And in the book from Donald Miller, The Story of World War II, he speaks directly from what the 34th Infantry Division experienced. This is from Robert Capra, who was a war correspondent, who was embedded with the 34th Infantry Division. What I'm about to read to you is exactly what Bill would have seen along his sector prior to and during the front, or during the assault on January 24th. So it reads, quote, "In mid-January, Clark's men consolidated their positions for another drive on the Winter Line." That's another name for the Gustav Line. "They broke through only to run into a new and even stronger defensive system high in the rugged mountains of southern Rome, now called the Gustav Line. Robert Capra was with the 34th Infantry Division when it first tried to break through the Gustav Line. Here's what he saw. As he climbed the steep slopes of Mount Patano, The dead had not yet been buried. Every 5 yards, a foxhole. In each, at least one dead soldier. Around them, torn covers of pocketbooks, soaked through and through, empty cans of sea rations, and faded bits of letters from home. The bodies of those who had dared to leave their holes were blocking his path. Their blood was dry and dusty, blending with the color of the late autumn leaves falling about them. And the higher I climbed, the shorter the distance between the dead. It was an absolute nightmare. No war isn't a nightmare, but in a space of nightmarish, hellish conditions, this was right up there with some of the worst battles fought in the Pacific by far. Rocky terrain. These are the things like Robert Capra. He would spend less than a year in Italy before he realized that he was suffering. He, a war correspondent, was suffering from war fatigue, from battle fatigue, and had to leave. So, any rate, I just wanted to share that with the audience because that's the sort of conditions that they fought. And they fought bravely, they fought gallantly. But at the end of the day, the first attack would fail. And we're going to talk more on the second attack on the other clip.
Some of the controversy that I've heard about in the decades after the war was that the Germans maintained they were not using Monte Cassino for for an outpost or for to wage war. What did you witness when you were there?
Well, we were told to say it seemed like we can see somebody in the windows besides priests. It seemed like we could see somebody in the window except priests. And that question was raised a lot.
Yeah. So when you went into the monastery, either before or after I guess after the battle or during, did you see any evidence that the German army had been there and had taken up residence in the monastery and using it to wage war?
Never saw a bit. We got to go back there in 1984. And the priest that was there at that time, they were very unfriendly. And that was 1984. That we got to go up there to the monastery where it was at. That's the reason I know the Polish has their cemetery there. But we went out to it and visited.
I thought that was a great question, Ryan, is how did he feel about it? I think for a lot of people who enjoy understanding history or are intrigued by it and study World War II, Monte Cassino's got to be up in the top 10 of things of most controversial acts perpetrated by the Allies during World War II. The monastery sat on a hill. It was 1,400 years old. It was full of, well, we'll get to that, but it had a lot of historical documents, relics, art, that sort of thing. And after the first attack failed by the 34th Infantry Division, General Clark, who wanted, as an American, and by the way, General Clark was a very controversial figure. We're going to talk more about him when they go into Rome. He wanted to breach the Gustav line. He wanted to show that the Americans could do it. And he realized in the first attack that they couldn't. And he brought in reserves. And the reserves that they brought in, it reads here again from Donald Miller's book, The History of World War II. Then Clark, who had desperately wanted this to be an American victory, reluctantly turned over the battle to General Alexander's reserve. So General Alexander is a British commander. He was the commander of the Eighth Army. But now he's the commanding general for all the Mediterranean theater. So Mark Clark, the American, reports to General Alexander. These reserves were international units made up primarily of New Zealanders and Indians and commanded by New Zealand's Bernard Freyberg, a hard campaigner who had 27 separate wounds on his body from previous fighting. He was a brave man. He won the Victoria Cross in World War I, right? This guy was a dude, all right? Like many of the men in the valley beneath Cassino that had become a Nazi shooting gallery, Freyberg was convinced that the Germans were using the monastery as an artillery observation post. And he must also have seen the enormous impact or the intact monastery had as a hated symbol of enemy defiance and personal failure, because it was still there and they were dying down the valley. Before he began his assault, he requests that the abbey be obliterated. Clark and Alexander were completely opposed to it. There was a lot of debate that occurred about whether or not the Germans were using the monastery, should they bomb it. But they eventually relented and allowed Bernard Freyberg's wish to be granted. And so on February 15th, 135 B-17s and other planes dropped 500-pound bombs and incendiaries on one of the sacred treasures of Christendom. They were followed by waves of medium bombers, which did the most damage, actually. Holding a wooden cross in front of him, the abbot of Monte Cassino led a group of survivors out of the devastation and towards the German lines. At the bottom of the valley, troops cheered wildly, and John would have been one of those, as they saw great columns of smoke and flame rising from the holy place. It was a monstrous act, and it was all for naught. The Germans had not been using the monastery, but they did use the mountains of rubble created by the bombing to build an almost impregnable defensive position, and from it repulse the New Zealanders. And I want to add one more thing before we open this up to a bit more dialogue, Ryan. He writes that the German Panzer Corps commander, General Fridolin von Senger und Enterlin, had not occupied the abbey partly because he was a lay Benedictine and partly because he had a better observation post on a high hill behind the monastery. Expecting the worst, he brought in trucks to remove to Rome all of the artworks and one of the great libraries of the world containing original manuscripts of Cicero, Virgil, Ovid, Seneca, and other luminaries. Only the abbot, who was in his 80s, 5 monks, and a party of caretakers were permitted to stay. So this is what's written. Now we're going to talk about what's not written. What's written is that the Germans, and there's actually film of this. I just saw it on YouTube. They filmed this and made it available to an international audience of them pulling carts and carts of these things out of the abbey. Apparently, the general didn't want to occupy the abbey. They had other better places to be. But on the other hand, you've got these men down in the valley living and dying like dogs. And can you really trust the Germans when they say they're not up there? Would you? Would you say, oh, well, as long as you say you're not using it as a artillery spotting post, then we're good. We'll just go around it. So, I mean, Ryan, what are your thoughts on this? What do you think we should have done?
Well, gosh,
Yeah.
you know, the United States did a military history review of the incident with Monte Cassino. And, I'm looking at a common source here, and it says the U.S. government's official position on the German occupation of Monte Cassino has changed over a quarter of a century. The assertion that the Germans used the abbey was irrefutable. Sorry, the assertion that the German use of the abbey was irrefutable was removed from the record in 1961 by the Office of the Chief of Military History. A congressional inquiry to the same office in the 20th anniversary year of the bombing stated, quote, "It appears that no German troops, except a small military police detachment, were actually inside the abbey before the bombing."
Yeah.
The final change to the U.S. Army's official record was made in 1969 and concluded that, quote, "the abbey was actually unoccupied by German troops," unquote. I don't have much more to add. Who am I to argue with the official chief historian of the U.S. Army? We'll never know unless someone comes forward from the other side and says, well, actually, me and my buddies were in there and we were using it for artillery spotting.
Because you only need one guy. You only need one guy with a radio. It's not like
Right.
You need 500 men up there to make a difference. And what's interesting is let's just say that the Germans did pull out like they said, and there was just a skeleton crew there and they did all that stuff. When the Allies bombed the Abbey, at that point, the Germans no longer, it was seen as a World Heritage Site. And even in a war, even against the Nazis, who did a lot of terrible things, there was still a war for hearts and minds. And so the Germans apparently didn't want to violate that by blowing up the Abbey or turning it into a forward operating base. But once we bombed it, the gloves were off. We're the ones that bombed this World Heritage Site. And from what I've read, the Germans reinforced, just flooded the rubble with some of these elite Fallschirmjäger, these elite German paratroopers, which would
Oh,
which meant when we went up there, when the New Zealanders went up there, they got absolutely smoked. They went there once, they went there twice. Those were the second and third battles, and it wasn't until the fourth battle in May where we'd actually breach that line. I want to add one more thing about New Zealand's Bernard Freyberg, the general with 27 wounds, who was a badass. He was a man. I heard him described on a YouTube channel as all bear and no brain. I've never heard that before. Thought I'd share with our audience. I thought it
well,
was
that's how
funny.
you're referred to, Tony. Come
Oh
on,
yeah,
man.
I know. But behind my back, this is the first time I've actually heard it with my ears, not someone saying that about me. So, so basically, uh, the other problem with the Italian campaign is the leadership on the Allied side is generally maligned for a lot of the decisions they made. Right, how we went on the Allied mainland was questioned. Even back in Sicily, when we didn't get to Messina quickly enough and prevent the Germans from crossing the Straits of Messina, which I can almost throw a rock across, was seen as a major faux pas on our part. And the it Freyberg has gone down as one of these generals who had faulty intelligence and wasn't really thinking clearly tactically about the situation well enough, and maybe advise something that shouldn't have been done. I'm at the position. So we talked in our last episode about reparations, and I know that that's not popular with some people. I think, one of the things we said was, when we interviewed Bill Malk, he was opposed to reparations with, Japanese who were interned during World War II. It was a terrible thing that we did, probably the worst civil rights infraction of the 20th century by far. I think what we did was shameful. But at the end of the day, we were kind of like, you know what? We got to let these veterans who were there have their opinion because their experiences are different than the ones that we have today. We can't expect our opinions to be their opinions. This feels like one of those things where we have on tape with John saying we were quite pleased with that Abbey going down. And if I'm one of those soldiers and I'm down there in a valley and I just read to you what it was like when Capra went up to those foxholes and saw dead men everywhere, I'd probably be cheering too. I'd probably think if that Abbey went up and if it just killed one German that isn't shooting him anymore, then it's worth it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm
Yeah.
I'm not saying that we should have done
Yeah.
it. I'm saying
No.
it's a terrible thing, but I'm saying is I am not going to cast aspersions at our GIs who were there if they hold a different opinion because
Right.
they were the ones getting shot at and I wasn't.
Well, it's the same logic that a lot of guys talk about with were they glad the atomic bombs were dropped?
Yeah, there you go.
It's
Exactly.
exactly the same logic. It's self-preservation in the end,
Yep.
and in their minds, a relic of Christendom, if it were destroyed, and no one was injured in that, just so that the Germans could not use it as a way to rain down metal on their heads, I think they would have probably been all for it, honestly.
100%.
And I can't disagree that I wouldn't have felt the same way.
Yep. It's just
So,
it's just we just need to be careful of that when we're listening to these firsthand personal accounts. And this one's
yeah.
special in the sense that we haven't heard this before, and he's still with us.
And this is the same thing. I'm sorry, I just want to
go
say
ahead,
real
go
quick. This is the thing that we have to kind of be careful of when we are armchair historians looking back 80 years ago, is going, well, they should never have done that. That's just horrible, blah, blah, blah. And it was horrible, but war is horrible. And you know what? Those guys were in a completely different situation, making decisions on lives of many thousands of men. I'm going to give them some grace, so to speak, no pun intended, on trying to understand what I would have done in that situation.
Yep.
And let it stand. It is what it is.
Because audience, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. What I was hoping to find with all the research I did was we have irrefutable evidence that Germans were there and we should have bombed it. And I can't find it.
You can't find it. No,
it's not there. And so at the end of the day, I've got to default to history happens to the people who are there more than the people who are here now. And if you're the one getting shot at, then you get the trump card in this.
We may have a rebuttal coming from our friend Jesse Gilman about this, because he went over there and visited, and apparently gave them a piece of his mind when he did a tour of Monte Cassino and espoused the other perspective, which was we did not do, that you guys were using it and stuff. Anyway, so
but think about that. That didn't happen too long ago. The Italians are still pissed at us for it. We're still. I mean, talk about reparations, right? We're still thinking about what we do for reparations for that. They rebuilt it. It's there. But man, it is a 1,400-year-old abbey that we destroyed. Now, I'm going to add one more thing before we play next clip. While all this is going on, the first, second, and third battles of Monte Cassino to breach the Gustav line. After the first battle, the 34th Infantry Division gets absolutely hammered, and they have to go leave the front lines to get reconstituted. On January 22nd, so just a week or two after the first battle at Anzio, or almost contemporaneously, we did the landings behind enemy lines, behind the Gustav line, further north on the Italian peninsula in Anzio. Now, this is, I'm going to read just a little bit what happened there. First off, this whole Italian battle campaign, all of it was under-resourced. So when we landed at Salerno, remember I said it was like Tarawa? It was a debacle. We almost got our butts kicked off the beaches, and the Navy ships had to come in and save our butts. Part of that had to do with we only had about 400 landing craft available to ferry troops back and forth. So we couldn't come aboard. We could not come on the Italian peninsula with this massive force. To compare that, on Normandy, we would use 4,000 of these landing craft, not
just
400.
Yeah.
Right. So why did we only have 400 landing craft for this? Because those landing craft were going up for the Normandy invasion that was going to happen about 6 months after this battle. So we weren't properly resourced. Anzio was even worse. We had around 300 landing craft. We could only land 2 divisions behind enemy line. Now, they were great divisions. They were the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division and the British 1st Infantry Division, but just 2 divisions. And also with a guy named John Lucas, who was a close confidant of Mark Clark. General John Lucas was told by Mark Clark. Remember, Mark Clark landed at Salerno and almost got his butt kicked, almost pulled the men off the beaches, almost pulled the plug on the Salerno invasion. It was that bad. So he told John, don't stick your neck out. Well, here's the problem. When we landed on Anzio, here I read from his book again. On January 22nd, 1944, almost 50,000 men, far too few to do the job, landed at Anzio. The enemy was caught off guard. The only Germans on the beach were 4 drunken officers who drove their military car into the open door of an Allied landing ship. Repeat that. These 4 drunken officers were driving along the beach. They were so drunk, they drove onto one of our landing ship that was disengorging its contents. Under advice from Clark to proceed cautiously, Major General John Lucas failed to take advantage of the enemy's absence and to move inland quickly to the Alban Hills, which were 28 miles from Rome. While Lucas delayed, General Kesselring brought in 100,000 troops, secured the high ground around the beach's perimeter, and it turned into an absolute bloodbath. It was, we couldn't reinforce it. We were always under enemy fire. Here's what someone wrote about trying to keep the beaches clear on the Gray's registration. He wrote that when there was an intact body on Anzio beachhead and it had not been found for a while, it bloated and changed color. The guy from Gray's registration said, they don't get all blue. Some of them get black, but they all stink. There's one stink, and that's it. You never get used to it either. And after a while, that stink gets in your clothes. You can taste it in your mouth. You know what I think? This man said, I think maybe if every civilian in the world could smell that stink, maybe we wouldn't be here right now. And so on February 16th, again, while John and the 34th ID are repairing themselves and getting ready to go help this failed Allied landing, the Germans counterattacked. So that we hadn't reinforced it yet, right? John's still in Naples, getting ready to go to Anzio. He said at one point on February 16th, the shelling strangely stopped for a moment, and then seconds later, the Germans threw everything into a furious counterattack that nearly drove the invaders back into the sea. Hospitals were bombed, nurses and patients were killed, and cooks and truck drivers were put on the line to stem the enemy advance. In desperate fighting, the Allies held just barely by the tremendous point-blank artillery fire, along with Navy and air support. So that's the situation that's going on just north of this failed Gustav line attack. Is the Anzio beachhead is barely holding on. it needs to be rescued. Forget the beachhead creating conditions where they can surround and go behind the Gustav line. The Anzio beachhead needs to be saved. And in a couple of clips, we're going to hear more about how the 34th Infantry Division did that. But before we get there, we still have a couple more clips of John telling us more about what it was like on the front lines before he made it to Anzio. Well, for those who have heard anything or read anything about the Italian campaign, you would know that Anzio was its own special version of hell. But before John would go there, he's going to share more experiences with us next week on his experiences on the front line, what it was like, the living conditions, the medics, the wounded, the injuries, and then ultimately the landing on Anzio that he would participate in. So please join us next week. John's historical account, firsthand personal account of what it was like to be an infantryman or rifleman in Italy will continue then. So see you next week.